Well, ladies and gentlemen, here we are. Fantastic. We've got a great show for you tonight. I am so pleased that everybody is tuning in. We are going to be talking about, here are my notes, we're going to be talking about some pretty cool stuff today. There are some cyber government legislations coming down the pipe. National state threat actors in particular, the White House executive order to strengthen the cyber breach notifications for the federal government, some potential immunity, and anything else that you would like to talk about. I'm one of your hosts, and James Azar, as you can see, is not here with us today. He'll be back next week. Instead, we have a very special guest, Aristedes Mahairas. Give us a wave, Ari. Say hello to the crowd. So Ari's now in the private sector, but retired with distinction from the Federal Bureau of Investigation as the special agent in charge of counterintelligence in their cyber division for New York. So we're going to get to a couple of conversations with Ari in just a moment. We've got to do the disclaimer. All opinions in this broadcast are our personal opinions and do not represent any company or organization we are affiliated with. And when James comes back next week, make sure we start harassing him on that black shirt, because he's reached out to the Wounded Warrior Project. We're going to raise some money to get him into the most ugly paisley shirt we can possibly find. The more money, the uglier the shirt. All right, let's get to a couple of comments already. So here we are. Good evening, Matt. Thanks for joining in, Matt. Awesome. Good to see you again. And Paul Cummings is with us as well. Thank you, Paul, from Jacksonville. And someone's saying her shalom. Somebody, a LinkedIn user, is saying shalom. Thank you very much. And yes, of course, it was Passover last weekend. And Miguel, always good to see you, my friend. So, Ari, what are your thoughts about our discussion today, my friend?
Well, the first decision I made today, Eddie, was to wear a shirt and tie. This way I can avoid the shirt controversy, right? I want to make sure I'm far away from that between you and James. But no, seriously, I want to thank you, and I want to thank James for the opportunity to join you on the TechTownSquare. I think it's fantastic, and it affords us an opportunity to discuss any topic in the cyber realm. And tonight you mentioned three of the topics: cyber threats, legislation, and maybe even nation state actors. And we know that each one of these topics can be a whole series unto themselves, right? But I'm looking forward to, more than anything, the discussion and the questions that our audience will take us down, which path they'll take us down. I understand they're very engaged, so I'm looking forward to it. But jumping right into this whole topic of cybersecurity, like, where do we begin? I like to typically start off by saying, like, not one day goes by that we don't hear of or read another article where there was another incident that is taking place. In fact, earlier today, just reading some of the old news, which is not that old, I read an article about an incident that took place this past weekend in Australia, where a hack actually interrupted live TV. And they're investigating that to see whether or not it was sabotage or maybe nation state activity. And then I read another article, just flipping this top two articles that came through, that there was a whistleblower who was alleging that the Ubiquity hack that took place earlier this year was a lot more serious than what was initially alleged, right? So these are just examples that point to the fact that cybercrime and the threats that they pose are very significant. And it's a significant concern, I think, for both the public and the private sector. We just can't get away from it. In fact, from my perspective, and this is drawing now on my prior experience with the federal government and involvement in counterintelligence and cyber operations, I think cybercrime is probably the most significant national security threat that is developing over the last 15 years. And, years ago, when we first started talking about cybercrime and cyber threat actors, we would typically, well, I see that Matt is agreeing with that. Thank you, Matt. But, when we first started talking about and discussing cyber attacks, we would talk about how the actors were just kind of acting up, these bad guys, and, just sitting around, messing around because they could, right? They were just trying to prove a point. But I think if we just pause for a second and realize everything that's happening over the course of these last few years, we'll realize that these malicious actors are morphing past what we would describe as a nuisance into a much more sinister activity, and with a targeted purpose, right?
Well, so disrupting TV, that's pretty wild. Well, and Paul's saying here, Red Canary revealed today. What was the Red Canary reveal? Did you hear about that one? And Paul, if neither of us have heard, just expand on that one a little bit, because that's really interesting, my friend.
Yeah, I haven't heard about the Red Canary one.
Right. And Matt's saying, yeah, we fight wars as if they are start and stop. Right. And it's an infinite game in cyber. Good point, Matt. Yeah, exactly. That's right.
It is an infinite game, and as this game continues, the athletes, if you will, are becoming faster. They're becoming stronger, and they're becoming more adept to the defenses that we put up. And you can take any sports analogy to that, but it's sort of that mindset that we, as individuals, as corporations, and as a government, need to get involved. It's that gang again that was running around the streets, maybe breaking windows, the nuisance that has now become more sophisticated, more methodical. They go underground, they're quiet, they plan, they practice, and then they attack. And they do that for a lot of reasons, right? Because we know that a lot of their motivation is money. And they'll steal your sensitive information and sell it to the highest bidder. That's what they do. But we also see, again, like following up on that athlete comparison, right? They're becoming sophisticated, and they've gone from individuals, transnational organizations, to even nation state activity. And so though some of those nation states, their motivation really is money, they all have a similar motivation, and they're typically trying to gain, at least from my perspective and the cases have been involved, they want to gain a tactical and economic or military advantage. So that's some of what we are, or multiple bidders, not only the highest bidders, but multiple bidders, absolutely. And you know what? We've seen that where there actually is a price war, overbidding because people are deeming the information to be that significant that will lead them to a big payday, right? But so what does that mean? Like, what is the impact of all of this? So we talk a little bit about the history. We talk about how fast it's moving. But I just took a couple of minutes, and when I say a couple of minutes today, I took a couple of minutes to look up the FBI's IC3, right, or the Internet Crime Complaint Center report for 2020. 800,000 complaints filed this year. Just over $4 billion in losses. The $4 billion losses in 2020 represents 31% of the 13 billion losses that was tracked over a 5-year period.
Wow.
So this year alone, we're 31% of that 5-year period.
Right.
And we can talk a little bit about the business email compromise and ransomware, but I think Matt's making a point here.
Well, and it's an interesting point because, yes, the Chinese government, of course, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, they don't run business in China, but of course they govern there. They govern private industry in China. That's right. So they don't make a distinction there, which gives them, I think, frankly, an edge.
Well, it gives them a big edge, right? When we're, I guess, two competitors in the same ring, but the rules are different for each, then the rules that they are governed by, or the lack of rules they're governed by, gives them that competitive edge against us. I mean, think about China and the requirements they have of foreign corporations operating in China. They are required to not only give them, a lot of their internal data, but their source code, like the secret sauce that makes their application, makes their software, makes whatever their business model is, makes it work. Like they are instructed, they cannot operate unless they pass that information over to China. Right. And in fact, I'll take it even one step further. China has various organizations out there that are tasked with collecting this type of technical information and ensuring it's being passed over to the Chinese military, who are predominantly leading the charge in these cyber operations.
Yeah. And put in another sentence, an edge in stealing with justification from private business as if it were espionage. Right. Super interesting. But yeah, you were saying a little earlier, though, what a point you were making up a little bit earlier about your experience with the Bureau. What was that again? I want to come back to that.
So no, based on the investigations and the investigations we conducted out of the FBI's New York office, and of course the intelligence that had access to, and we won't touch on anything that's classified, but you can see sort of the themes, the various nation state actors and what their motivations were and why they would operate in certain areas. And so, typically when I was speaking about this at events, or even, in my writings, I talk about, the usual suspects, and those are the top four: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea.
Right.
And so they have, North Korea, we can say, is predominantly motivated by money. And when I first came across this concept, quite foreign to me, because why is it that a nation state is actually chasing money? But when we pause for a second and realize the actual economic condition that North Korea functions under as a closed society in the shadows of China, and really can't do anything unless the Chinese sort of provide that approval, you realize why they go out and attack and try to recover monies, because that's how they have to fund their, not only their country, their basic operations, but also their programs, their military programs.
Yeah, exactly. And let me get to this. Matt, no way, man. This show is for you. It's not an interruption. This is a welcomed part of our dialogue. So please jump in. We are here to serve you, my friend. And Paul Cummins is saying, at what point can we discuss weaponize as companies to reverse engineer if, say, China or another advanced persistent threat nation state has presence on our networks? Yeah, we discussed this a little bit last week as well. And, this act that maybe we'll get to, that the White House is trying to push forward, this executive order right now, really, I don't think does anything to help us in that regard, right? That I understand, the executive order is to strengthen the cyber requirements for federal agencies to simply disclose if they have had a breach. And then also with some kind of immunity in there. This thing's really, and that shirt. I knew the shirt thing would come. I knew it happened. The Paisley said it. I set you guys off last week, so I'm like, okay, I'm going to one up the Paisley tonight. All right. Well, anyway, we're setting the stage for James pretty quick here. But yeah, I wonder how getting back to Cummings's quote there. I wonder how we're going to tackle that, because you're right. They are quite broke. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned, Eddie, the possibility of an executive order coming down, and it may have been issued already, as some people were trying to anticipate it coming out this week. I'm not sure if it came out, but the executive order would, as you indicated, direct software vendors who engage with the federal government, and I think that's where the hook is, right? If you want to do business with the federal government, you have to comply with our rules and regulations and requirements, and so therefore, what they want to do is have these software vendors disclose breaches to the U.S. government. And again, there's some form of immunity involved in that. But there's other ways of doing it too, besides the executive order. With a lot of people in this day and age are now saying, especially with what is taking place with the last administration and this current administration, these executive orders flying off the bat.
Yeah.
What they're saying is we can actually implement this same protocol, but we can do that under the National Cyber Director. And as you may recall, the National Defense Authorization Act that was passed and brought into law in January authorizes for the first time a National Cyber Director, which is a Senate-confirmed position, if I'm not mistaken, that will function in the executive branch. And in that position, the law allows for, in fact, provides additional authorities, and specifically states that the National Cyber Director can promulgate such rules and regulations as may be necessary to carry out the functions, powers, and duties vested in that director, right? So that director can implement some programs and some policies to impact the companies that are doing business with the federal government, but it raises a whole lot of questions. Like, is that really going to be effective? Like, how we can put that policy in place, but then what are the checks and balances to ensure? And, we talk about this possible, what do they call that? A sort of a bill of particulars, or some kind of scoring mechanism to tell us how good the software is.
Yeah, private industry, I think, would have taken a shot at this if it was as simple as that. And Matt brings up a great point too. He's saying, the software vendors would have to stop lying to themselves, their uneducated and immature client base in the bell curve, and share with the FBI and other letter soup intelligence communities. You brought up an interesting point in previous conversations with me about that, Ari, because when you were serving with the Bureau and there was a breach at a private industry, you were telling me they're kind of reluctant to engage you guys in a timely fashion.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of reasons for it. At first, I didn't understand it, but having spent a significant amount of time with executives from these respective corporations, came to the realization that, surprisingly enough, many companies didn't realize the role and function of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In many instances, and again, very surprising to me, but this is why it's important to go out and have face-to-face conversations and establish these relationships with the private sector, which as a government investigative agency, you rely on to do your job. But they confused the Federal Bureau of Investigation with being a regulator. So that was one of the issues. And they thought that some kind, in way, shape, or form, regulatory obligations would kick in if they brought in law enforcement. And so we would have to explain the fundamental difference between the investigator versus the regulator. But one of the things that I used to tell these corporations was, more than anything else, speaking with law enforcement, whichever agency you feel most comfortable with, and let that agency direct you to the appropriate resource. Telling your regulator that you're actually speaking with an investigator can only help you and not hurt you. Well, they were concerned then, some people were, that, well, if they engaged law enforcement, then law enforcement had an obligation to notify the regulator. And so in many instances, I would say, yeah, not quite accurate, because one of the things we do is say, we trust you, corporate America, to realize when you've crossed those thresholds that require you to notify your regulator. It's not for us to make that determination for you. That's why you have inside counsel. That's why you have outside counsel. That's why you have all these subject matter experts organically within your organization to help guide you through that process. And in fact, we are not the ones to go to the regulators, because the last thing we want to do is at least give the appearance or the impression that we are re-victimizing a victim. Because remember, under all these circumstances, an organization, a company who has been compromised electronically, they're victims of a crime. And so it's not in the FBI sort of DNA to re-victimize victims. So we work with them and we help bring the proper parties together so that we can find a good resolution and trying to figure out from the investigative perspective, who was behind it, what was the motivation, what actions can we take to prevent future events like this happening.
And Matt brings up a similar point. Yeah, exactly. On behalf of the customers out there that are wondering about this, is pure ignorance. They don't know. They feel that the FBI is here for cyber, and they may tell on them for other things, right? Ironic. Yeah, shares freely under some great partnerships with the FBI directly, as well with the InfraGard. You're absolutely right, Matt. Yeah, exactly. And what do you think about that organization, Ari? I mean, they.
So yeah, InfraGard's good, but I wanna amplify one of the points that Matt made there, right? That some of the concern is, yeah, the FBI knocks on your door, you let them in, you're discussing cyber, but we're actually looking for something else. Matt, that's a really interesting point, and I've encountered that in several instances as well. And one of the things that I did and the teams did, as we were in part of this engagement, we would be absolutely clear with what it was we were looking for, right? So we need those bits and pieces of information, those bits and bytes that will help us identify what is taking place and who is responsible for it, right? We're always looking for attribution, so that at least in the cases of nation state actors, if we can't really put the arm of justice on the individuals, at least we can, create some consequences for them. The U.S. government's approach in law enforcement has a long memory, and so these individuals that are responsible or acting on behalf of a nation state, they have to be concerned of when they're going to cross the wrong border and who's going to pick them up and return them back to the U.S. to be charged. But one of the things we did was make it abundantly clear to the victim organizations that in order for us to do our job, we don't want to see content. We don't want to see anything you don't want to show us. But you should be willing to show us those things that will help us resolve the situation. Those pieces of technical information, those indicators of compromise that will help lead us to those responsible, so that we can have positive attribution, and then working with our prosecutors, be able to develop those charging instruments and move that investigation forward. There's a couple of different ways that the FBI undertakes to educate the public on what its capabilities are. And Matt raised one of those, and that's InfraGard. And every FBI office has their own InfraGard, which is really a smart gathering, I like to say, of the public-private. It's a great example of public-private collaboration, where these monthly meetings take place. The FBI provides briefings of the latest and greatest trends that are taking place, and that informs the public on some of the things that they have to be wary of and some of the precautions and risk mitigation strategies they can implement. But, it's always a moving target, and it goes back to one of the points that was made very early on. We play a game as if though it starts stop, but this is an infinite game that just continues. And rarely, if ever, do you get a timeout in it as well, right?
Yeah, right. Okay, let me get to a couple of comments here. So yes, Paul Cummings is saying, Matt, I agree, especially when criminals have found that golden threshold to a monetary amount they can get away with before it becomes a federal national. Yeah. Do you know, there was the CNA hack on Friday, very interesting, an insurance company. We discussed this, Ari, earlier this week. So this insurance company was hacked. I think the news came out on Thursday, Friday. They're not being very forthcoming. They're not being like the Microsoft doctrine, what's becoming known as the Microsoft doctrine, where they're just opening up the kimono and saying, yes, this is Microsoft. So we even got our source code right in this last hack exposed. So good for Microsoft. Very, very brave. This insurance company is not doing that as much. And they're saying, we'll just let the customers know if they've been affected. But here's what's interesting about it is, what if the threat actors were looking for policy information? Because they downloaded the database, right, of all of their customers. I suspect for ransomware, right, and the new version of ransomware, extortion ransomware, where if people don't pay, they'll extort them by saying, hey, we'll sell your information to the highest bidder or just expose it online. Now, if you had the insurance policy of a Fortune 500 company and you knew exactly what the ransom amount that is insured for, well, you can ask for that amount. So the criminals are becoming much more sophisticated. Let's say you've got a $10 million policy where your insurance company will pay $10 million. Now the threat actors know exactly how much to ask for in their ransom. So that's what we're looking at in that piece. And what other comments have we got? Yeah, Matt's saying, Matt, tell us what you do for a living, my friend, because I have breakfast with my local cyber FBI team monthly. Okay, fantastic. Wow, that's really impressive.
And Matt, I would encourage you to continue that relationship, because there is nothing better than making sure you have a personal relationship with those people who you will call upon to help you in a time of crisis. The last thing you want to do is have that conversation for a first instance when you're in the middle of a crisis. You don't have time to do that. And not only that, but the benefit of doing what you're doing, and I can't emphasize how critically important it is, and how much how much benefit you will absolutely yield if you do this, is you have an opportunity to work through all your questions ahead of time. Because we know that in response, and even with the CNA hack, response time is critical to understanding and to mitigating whatever that risk is. Eddie, I want to go back to the comment that Paul had with regard to monetary levels, and the implication that the criminals are now sophisticated, that they can go up to a certain threshold, let's say in the New York Southern or Eastern District, which is a very busy district. And so their monetary loss thresholds may be a little bit higher than maybe some of the other smaller districts. That's where the FBI's IC3 comes in, right? And that's why the public is always encouraged to report hacks, even if the monetary amounts are small. So maybe I get, hit up for a ransomware attack for $10,000. Well, the government's not going to investigate a $10,000 ransomware, and that's probably right. But one of the things that the IC3 analysts do is they try to connect the data points. And if they establish that pattern that shows Ari's ransomware crew is responsible for the last 100 events, they aggregate the total. So 10,000 plus 10,000 plus 100,000. Next thing you know, you well beyond whatever a threshold amount is. And so that will trigger a full field investigation, utilizing all the resources available within the federal government's holdings, and also get the U.S. Attorney's offices engaged as well. Right. So that's why it's important to report it, as small as it may be and as insignificant as you may think it is. On the back end, what's happening is a lot of work, a lot of analysis to try and connect these things and see where the commonalities are.
Beautiful, yeah. And Matt just ratifying that this is a common goal, right? We're in this together, and profitability can't be the only decision maker. And then a little later, he says it mentions community policing. Where's that? There's that comment right there. Actually, that's from LinkedIn user, New School Community Policing. I love that. Yeah, me too. I heard that term Microsoft doctrine actually from James the first time, but it's really taking a buzz. And I think we really need to edify those guys for really opening up the kimono, because that was a big deal, right? Actually getting entry into the source code and for them to actually disclose that. And they didn't have to. There's nothing in any piece of paper that would say that they are compelled to tell us that the threat actors went that far, but they did. So thank you, Microsoft. And they need to be applauded for it.
So, Eddie, maybe you can take just a few seconds to explain to us or give us what the distinction is between CNA's response and then what the Microsoft doctrine is, right? Maybe you can just flesh that out a little bit.
Well, I think so. I think James is coining this term to kind of, just highlight the fact that Microsoft are, I think, the golden example of when you're breached, you need to disclose as fast as possible to the entire world, not just select customers. So what CNA is saying right now, or at least the last I read, which was on the weekend, is they're saying, if we find that a particular customer has been breached, we will inform them. And that's all they were saying. And on their website, because everything went down. And so they threw up a quick web page that basically just said that. And so it's like, guys, you got to do a better job than that, because, if I'm one of their customers, I'm going to be really wondering, right? I'm going to be really stressed out. So I think, and what Microsoft did is they said, they didn't only just say we got breached, but they said, here's exactly where we got breached, right? Here's the Exchange server. And oh, by the way, they got right into the source code. And that made CISOs around the world sit up and go, okay, I better fortify everything to do with Microsoft Exchange right now, because we just don't know if there's a vulnerability in it for us. So, good for those guys for doing that. And I don't like to say shame too easily, because, you don't want to victimize the victim again. But I think it's a reflection of the fact that they didn't have a good disaster recovery plan statement. And that's something people often forget to do. In their DRP, they don't have a written statement for when, and this is what you've got to tell these corporations, when you are breached, not if, when you're breached, what do you want to say to the public? So general counsel obviously has got to be engaged with that, but they have to have a statement. And you can see that these guys were just, on the fly with their statement. So yeah, I love that too. All right, let's get to a few more comments. Matt's jumping in here. They pulled the Dun & Bradstreet numbers and see what reinsurance exists. Wow, that's interesting. Thank you, Matt. That's a new thought for me. And Matt's also jumping in. The reason they caught the Boston bomber was the early collaboration with Leo. What's Leo? And other
law enforcement officers.
Okay. And is that a nickname for law enforcement officers, Leo? I didn't know that.
I'm pretty sure he's not talking about a guy named Leo. So.
And other infrastructure so they could respond. That's right. This is the concept that drove me from the relationship I have. I gotcha. Miguel's jumping in on some comments here. How the government should have handled situations when companies don't come clean when they were breached. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. You've just taken us in another direction here, a good direction. Yeah, we're building the plane as we fly with this whole internet thing for the last 25 years. And, right now, I think it's still a little bit of a mess. How should governments do that? Please jump in with comments and suggestions on how you think it should happen. And, jump in. What's your comment, Harry?
Here we go. I'm raising my hand. I want to make sure. So how should governments handle situations when companies don't come clean when they were breached? Great question. There's a couple of angles here. First and foremost, we need to understand, I think, the company that has been breached. Is it a company that is governed by regulators? If so, that's pretty sort of laid out what it is. Many times, though, there's a debate that takes place internally when a breach notification has to come. For example, there'll be a significant breach. What is not defined for them is what is significant. Is it 10 profiles, or is it 1,000 profiles, customer profiles, right? Containing PII information. Let's make sure that we're saying all the right buzzwords, right? So that's where the companies get together internally and they sort of circle the wagons. They engage their attorneys, both in-house and outside counsel. to make sure that they're looking at this aggressively. But many times, again, they take a long time to come up with a decision, and they keep everybody at arm's length away. And so remember what we said, time is of the essence in these instances, and they're concerned. And so we, law enforcement, or past tense we, law enforcement, loses the opportunity to take advantage because a lot of the items, the forensic information on the networks, is perishable. And we've seen a lot of hacks where, especially in nation state activity, and the Russians are probably the best or close to being the best at it, where they can hide the digital breadcrumbs they leave behind as they're coming through your network, right? Those breadcrumbs, that digital exhaust, they have a way to hide that. So if you can't get in there fast enough, you won't be able to. But how do we deal with it? Look, at the end of the day, you cannot compel a victim to engage with law enforcement with regard to letting them in or helping them conduct an investigation. But on the regulator side, though, they can levy heavy fines. So whether it's the California Consumer Protection Act or the New York Division of Financial Services, if they're not within compliance, or GDPR, and in this day and age, we have a lot of global organizations, and I know, Eddie, you could speak to GDPR and sort of that structure and the fines associated with the lack of notification. I think it's a 72-hour window you're provided to make that notification to figure out what happened, right? Yeah. So it's the regulators that can actually force some action, but from the government, on the government side, but from the investigative enforcement side, non-regulatory enforcement, it becomes a little bit more tricky.
Yeah, and we have a Shield in New York now too. So the SEC, if you're a publicly traded company, the SEC requires that you disclose. But again, there's some gray area, as you mentioned there. Private companies, to my knowledge, still don't have to disclose. So legislation to make them disclose, I think, will be certainly a step in the right direction. It'll be messy, but let's make the step. I want to get to a couple of comments here. A little earlier, Matt was saying, I share denatured telemetry that hides my customers but provides the TTPs. Right on. Matt was also saying, nice question, Miguel. Miguel, that was a great question. Good direction you've taken us here. And Matt's jumping in saying, how quickly does the US government define a critical infrastructure that is covered under CMMC? What's CMMC? Do you know what that is, Ari? Otherwise, we'll have to ask Matt to jump in.
I've heard the term, and it's an acronym for something. Matt can help us. But critical infrastructure is an interesting question, because if I'm not mistaken, critical infrastructure is actually defined in Presidential Policy Directive, or PPD 41, which was signed into law under President Barack Obama in 2016, where critical infrastructure is actually delineated. And if I'm not mistaken, I think there are 17 sectors. And so what is that? It's health.
Right. It's, utilities, water, hospitals,
energy, telecommunications, yeah. Right? Financial sector. So these are critical infrastructure sectors. And interestingly enough, when there is an attack on PPD, an attack on a critical infrastructure sector, PPD 41 kicks in, and it's a three-part sort of approach to handling what's considered to be a significant event targeting, let's say, the financial sector. And there's three organizations or three federal agencies that are involved in this process. The FBI has primacy in investigations. Department of Justice. The FBI vis-a-vis the Department of Justice has primacy in investigations, which basically means they're trying to figure out who did it and what's behind it. The Department of Homeland Security is tasked with asset remediation. So how can we get the victim's assets, network, endpoints, whatever is involved, how can we get that up and running? Because theoretically, if critical infrastructure is hit, it has a greater impact to the entire nation and potentially in certain instances globally, if we're talking about one of the 8 systemic, major financial institutions out there. And then you have the Office of the Department of National Intelligence. And those guys and gals are responsible for informing, providing intelligence that's gathered in the wild, right? And sort of helping us figure out what happened and helping us figure out what part of the network has been compromised that needs specific attention. So those are the three parts that play in when PPD 41 is enacted. And if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves me correctly, we probably saw the PPD 41 enacted on the solar wind hack, right? Because it hit the supply chain. And they instituted the Unified Command Group, where it becomes centralized, and to address what had happened there. And that's actually, obviously it was a very significant event, an incident. But it actually is a good example of what happens when the public and the private sector work together to address an issue. And so Microsoft, once again, got involved with other private sector companies as well as government agencies to identify, seize, and take down the command and control structure that was behind the SolarWinds attack. And so therein lies a great example of the effectiveness of public-private collaboration after the fact. I think, though, what we need to do is work on prevention, right? Because prevention is always better than the cure. Unfortunately, we know that's not going to happen. And I'm just thinking, and it goes back to your point of being prepared, right? What happened with CNA and the lack of a response or prepared response on the public relations side. We need to be prepared for those moments where we know it's going to happen. How do we make the organizations more resilient?
Right. Fantastic. Sam, thank you for jumping in. It's great to have you here. It's a regulation coming soon, I believe. I think that was in regards to private companies being compelled to disclose if they've had a breach, which there's some big private companies out there, right? So that would be fantastic. Interesting from Matt here. It's okay, you're the acronym guy, Ari. It's a C3PAO-driven capitalism-funded audit. Yeah, you're going to have to explain that one to me, Matt.
Matt's going to have to explain that one.
Fantastic. I love it. All right, awesome. And Paul Cummins is saying, this is kind of interesting, right? I'm getting asked if I am a CMMC auditor already while retiring from the Navy after 20 years. And of course, CMMC, thank you for jumping in, Miguel and Matt, on this, cybersecurity maturation model certification. Should have known that one, actually. Fantastic. That's a good point. Yeah, that's more a prevention architecture. I'm very much a fan of that as opposed to detection, but hey, that's the perpetual battle we have with the CEO of organizations, right? Business first, and cybersecurity needs to be a very, very close second. Audit prevention, not self-check. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Right, now I understand, Matt, thank you. Part of prevention is awareness. Yes, this is a very passionate subject for me too, because our awareness campaigns and training programs are really not working. I keep using the perpetual example of, and I talk to CISOs all around the world, and I get this all the time. Hey, Eddie, I've just put all our people through a cyber awareness training, a corporation of 10, 20, 30, 50, 60,000 people. And then the very next day, they're circulating an unknown link of a video of a fat cat tripping over a lazy mouse. How do I get them to stop this? This is a problem, right? And it's more to do with learning and human nature. And that's kind of a psychology dialogue. In fact, that would be a great topic in and of itself to bring onto the town square at some point. I've got some interesting ideas. Maybe we'll discuss that next week. And maybe one day on air. Right, yeah, exactly. From what we were discussing a little earlier, Matt, thank you. And LinkedIn user 800-171 only applies to those companies providing services to US Gov. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, LinkedIn user. Didn't know that one. And then, yeah, Miguel, I like this guy. Well done. You're making friends there, Miguel. Miguel's kind of a buddy and a colleague of mine. As a matter of fact, we're both New Jersey boys. So, yeah, you two should connect up over LinkedIn after this. And, yeah, literally low on the fat cat. I always use that example. That's how you can get a user, right? Just show a looped video of a fat cat tripping over a lazy mouse, and that's it. That's all you need to do to get into an organization on a phishing attack. Yeah, it's a bizarre world, my friends.
So, Eddie, that brings me back to the point you said about training and awareness. And, when people are reaching out to you and saying, we just completed this whole program, cost us X dollars, and, this is what we're seeing in terms of behavior. And it goes to human behavior and, trying to develop that muscle memory. But I think one of the issues is many organizations don't have the appropriate policies in place with the requisite consequences for that type of behavior, right? Because we are a bunch of people that want to be understanding, and we don't want to see people get hurt, right? But at what point do we say that HR needs to be engaged?
Yeah.
To ensure that the sort of consequences are not only enforceable, right, but also commensurate with whatever the violation of the work policy is.
Right.
So I think that might be a little bit of the issue as it concerns it concerns at least the training and awareness piece, and why we don't have the appropriate, and I don't like using it, but I think it encompasses it well, the appropriate cyber hygiene being exercised by the employees.
And you mentioned muscle memory. I mean, so as you know, 20 years ago, I was an English teacher before I got into technology. And so I love learning and kind of, understand that, look, as a teacher, you go into the classroom every day to teach kids. Now, whether your lesson plan is brilliant or not, the real benefit is the fact that the kids get repetition and drilling. Okay, so there was a fabulous white paper that I read years and years ago by a West Point cadet. So this cadet had written a paper, and the title was Drilling versus Training. Now, here's the premise, here's the abstract of the paper. At the Battle of Gettysburg, it turns out that 90% of soldiers did not even discharge their weapon. Now, we know this from the 18,000 fully loaded muskets next to the fallen soldiers' bodies, unfortunately, and the full issue of bullets in their pouch. Now, the US military is meticulous with recording and governing and making sure they keep a record of absolutely everything. So this was recorded at the Battle of Gettysburg. Fast forward to the Vietnam War. The US military had completely reversed that trend where 90% of soldiers engaged in battle and ran into a hellfire of bullets. Why? The paper was about drilling and simulation, not training. It's a really good point. And it made me think about my background as a teacher. And I thought, well, yeah, because there are some crap teachers and there are some great teachers. But the benefit is drilling those kids every single day. And the neuroplasticity of your mind actually changes when you engage something on a daily basis. Look, you know this, you come from a disciplined background, right, Ari? So when you do something over and over again, at our age, we just wake up at 5:30, 6 o'clock, because we've been doing it for years. I can't sleep in anymore, right? And so lest you get neuroplastic change, you do not get behavioral change. Now, HR departments need to realize that. So now look at what we do, what we call cyber awareness training. Once a month, once a year, once a quarter. This is nothing. It is actually a complete waste of time. And there was a psychologist, Dr. Miller from Harvard. He wrote a paper. It is the most cited paper in psychological literature since 1956. And it is Miller's Law. Everybody knows it. It's the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. The average human being remembers 5 to 9 things for 20 minutes and then forgets them. That's Miller's Law. So look at how we do cyber training. We got some beautiful slides and some videos and that's all great. And then we test people immediately afterwards. So within that 20-minute threshold, but then the next day, fat cat tripping over the lazy mouse video, right? People tend to forget right immediately. Danielle, thanks for jumping in. Great to see you. So prevention needs to be done across all levels of business, from small to medium-sized businesses to large and mega-sized businesses. Exactly. And Miguel, thank you. Yeah, muscle memory is exactly right. We need muscle memory. And so I would suggest then, because look, the CEO is never going to allow people to do an hour's worth of cyber training every day. If you're an accountant at Bank of New York Mellon, you should be billing out at $700 an hour. But what if we could do 5 minutes of training a day? I mean, I think it's that important. I think we're at the place now where we can justify it to the business. This is water cooler time. 5 minutes of compelled training. Take it at your leisure, but it's got to be done sometime between the 9 to 5 hour, and you should jump in and do a little cyber exercise of some kind. That's what I certainly would propose. So Matt's jumping in on firing on friends is hard. Yeah, well, and that brings up a point that we should be tying, though, the performance of the cyber awareness training to their performance review. So not necessarily that's the one act that gets them let go, but certainly if you're not doing well, and let's say you're responsible in the organization for distributing money, you're signing checks, your accounts payable. It's like, look, you're not going to get fired, but we're going to put a second set of eyes on you. So now we're going to treat you like a child. You're not going to like that very much. Or if you're doing well, that year-end bonus is going to kick in a little nicer. So it should be tied into the performance programs, I think. And Miguel's saying, I think we need to drill more on the psychology. Yeah, I think you're right there. And Danielle jumping in on 5 minutes a day of cyber training sounds good to me. It sounds good to every cyber professional. We love that. Certainly.
So we can pivot back to another topic of prevention, right? And I think earlier I was trying to say that prevention is always better than the cure, but we need to start building more and thinking towards resiliency. What do we do? How do we do it when the bad day comes? Because it's on its way over, it will come. But on the prevention, I can't help but think, Eddie, that we keep preaching, guys like you and I and the rest of our group that's joining us today, keep preaching the things that we should be concerned about. Be careful with those email links and attachments sent from unknown senders. Be careful of the sense of urgency in the email communication that looks legitimate, but might be the basis of a business email compromise, or even ransomware. Right? Ransomware in 2020, the IC3 reported about 2,500 complaints that came in, an approximate loss of $30 million, and it's approximate only because those are estimates, don't include lost business, time, wages, or any files or other the collateral costs that you can use to probably push that number even higher. And it also, doesn't take into account those people who are just reporting a ransomware event, but no money lost, maybe wasn't paid, or maybe they just don't want to disclose how much money they paid in the ransom. And we know that the most common methods of the ransomware is, email phishing campaigns, open ports, or allowing somebody in through an RDP protocol, or even software vulnerability a la SolarWinds. Okay. We know that there's certain steps, though, that can be taken to recover from a ransomware incident, right? Have the appropriate backups, make sure that we're doing every once in a while full backups. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes energy, so that when the bad event happens and you become a victim of ransomware, you don't even have to engage with the perpetrator, the malicious actor. You can sort of shut down your systems and follow the sort of recovery process, and then reload from a last known good backup to your system. But it's not happening. Mm. And when I started talking about ransomware back in 2014, 2015, several years back, the ransom amounts were, 5,000, 10,000. I think, one of the early ones that we thought was really significant was $25,000, $50,000.
Even individuals were getting it for like $400 or $500.
Correct. Now we're past all of that, and we're in the millions. And it goes back to how we started the conversation with CNA. Are they really looking, or is it the Dun and Bradstreet reports where they're seeing what the cyber insurance policy limits are, and now they know who to target and they know what the policies are, so they know what amount to ask for. Right. But it's what is it? Why are we as organizations not really following the very things that we know should be done?
Right. It's a fantastic question. And I wanted to just say hello to Jeff Fields. Hello, Jeff Fields. Just talking back on the education piece, then we're going to jump back forward on Matt's comment for the ransomware. Exactly. The self-efficacy theory supports small successes repeated regularly that will lead to larger lasting successes. We've got to give people a sense of confidence, because you know what? The Pandora's box of technology to anyone outside of our world, look, we're a bunch of gadget geeks, right? I might be an English teacher, so yeah, I'm a languages guy, but I had a GPS on my bicycle when I was a teenager and it was this big, right? I just love gadgets. And so we tend to think in ones and zeros. The rest of the world doesn't. And we need to remember that. We need to remember our 80-year-old mothers, that it's just a Pandora's box of absolute complexity. Matt, yeah, one client lost $1.5 million. I mean, to Ari's point, on a certain companies, on a business email compromise chain. I've got something to say about business email compromise. Little tip I'm going to give you in a second. $500,000 from the payment they made to company A, and $900,000 to company C, paid the same threat actor. Really, they chain the attacks, and this one cost 1.5 mil, or 10% of IC3 data on ransomware. Wow, that is incredible, Matt. Thank you for jumping that in. Do you know, when it comes to business email compromise, here's a lovely little tip you can give the accounts payable department. Forget the reply button on your email. Just forget it. Don't ever use it. Take the extra few seconds to just, anytime you're replying to an email that is about a financial transaction, click forward and type in the known trusted email address of the person you've been doing business with for years. Don't click reply. So those spoofed email addresses, that whole problem will go away, and you'll eliminate a good 60% of the BEC kind of attacks that are coming your way. Sam's jumping back in again. Thank you, Sam. What's the duty of the security operations center at a company if the everyday employees can make a mistake at any moment to allow a threat actor to bypass a network? Yeah, well, this is what we're talking about with business email compromise. Exactly. Yeah.
It goes back to training and awareness, in my opinion. Even though we're not reaching that neuroplastic change that is required for behavior change that you explained to us, Eddie, we still have to be able to utilize training and awareness to sort of highlight you. For us, it's natural, right? Because we're in it. But those people who are not the natural geeks or the IT individuals, they need to be constantly reminded of it. And then we also need to leverage the technology that's out there to kind of help us achieve the result that we need. But yeah, absolutely, Sam, it's a difficult proposition. And I think if anybody comes up with that answer, they're going to be, they might be put up for a Nobel laureate on that one. I mean, it's a serious issue.
Right, exactly. And Matt's saying the answer to Ari, willful ignorance, to what you were saying a little earlier. That's about it, exactly. Danielle, jumping in again. Thanks, Danielle. Instead of programming the masses, what about building a smarter AI technology to stop phishing campaigns? It's always going to be people processing technology, but you're right. I think AI is starting to come of age. Look, I'm with a vendor for my employment, and vendors have been promising AI for years. It's more machine learning. I still call it machine learning. I mean, we say AI, but I think it's still interchangeable with machine learning. It's still if-then scenarios. But Danielle, you're right. And I think I'm starting to see also much more training, in addition to full stack engineers and cybersecurity engineers, AI engineers being needed in corporations. And so I really think that's coming. And I know the folks at the big tech companies are coming out with some pretty cool tricks here in the very near future. Miguel is saying cybersecurity is not an IT problem. Right. And this is why I've been campaigning for years to move the CISO out from underneath the CIO to report to the CEO with a dotted line to general counsel. There's lots of good reason for that. I could talk about that for an hour. And Matt's saying, Miguel, are we brothers? Get that DNA test done. You probably are brothers. Your guys are going back. You're going to have to connect. And Matt sees CISSP from a different mama. Exactly. Fantastic. All right. Right, where else shall we go? We've got 7 minutes in the show, so we've got a lot of time here. All right, beautiful. So, well, then let me talk about that a little bit on the campaign. I call it my own campaign to move the CISO up from under the CIO. One of the things that triggered that was actually the Volkswagen hacks. You remember this one? This was a while back, and it wasn't a hack. You see my vocabulary, even me, I'm saying that. So what Volkswagen Latin America did is they sourced a piece of software, a legitimate piece of software, not malware, a legitimate piece of software to deceive the emissions protocol, the national and international emissions protocol, to show that their diesel engines were not pushing out the emissions that they shouldn't have been pushing out. They were, okay? So it was a complete violation of the emissions protocol. Guess what? It was the CIO who made that decision along with other directors at the company and got one of the CIO's IT folks to go out and find a piece of software that could deceive the emissions protocol software that was coming in testing their engines. Now, the CISO, how is the CISO going to find this? Number one, it's not a piece of malware. Number two, the CISO is policing his or her boss. So this thing is no longer working. And that's what triggered me to say, okay, we need to start changing that. Additionally, a CISO needs to engage with the CEO and, again, dotted line to general counsel, because it is about risk and not about IT, something Miguel was saying a little bit earlier, right? You are risk mitigators as CISO. You have to understand IT. Also, CIOs get their year-end bonus by saving budget, right? CISOs need to spend money. Right? CISOs have to be right 100% of the time. Threat actors only need to be right 1% of the time. So to govern a CISO's life and year-end, reviews and bonuses on saving money, it just doesn't work. So we need to change that relationship. And Danielle's jumping in with CISOs on the board of directors. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah, we're starting to see that a little bit. The CIO, at least a few years ago, I don't know if it's still the case, at Bank in New York Mellon, Bridget Engel, I think her name was, she's still there. She's on the board of BNY, so that's cool. But we need to start seeing some CISOs on those boards too, and I certainly advocate for that as well. Matt's jumping in with every day I see CISOs and myself am not at the real table. It's a tragedy, man. Rather an adjunct table, one level below. My operations director is amazing and absolutely helps me drive my mission. Fantastic to hear. But I agree so very much with this mission. Yeah, actually a mutual acquaintance of both Ari and I over at ADP, the payments company. He's the chief security officer, so has cyber as well as physical security. Roland Kutler does report into the CEO. So that's a beautiful progression. So good for him. And a comment here by Matt saying, Danielle, Goodwin, yes, so much, right.
So what I would say that as we have just a few minutes left, I guess, with regard to sort of where the CISO should be in the organizational chart. Years ago, everybody was saying we need to get the appropriate people inside the boardroom, right, to address the elephant in the boardroom, which was the whole cyber topic, because, the CEOs in that C-suite sort of group, right, they just didn't understand cyber or what the risks were, right? And, we had to come up with a way to define risk and put a monetary amount on that, a dollar value, because that's kind of what they do, right? It's, vision, a plan moving forward, and then what's the bottom line? And, describing the risk is, whatever threat exists, if it meets a vulnerability, what's that impact? But that was years ago, where maybe we can say that there wasn't maybe a full understanding because the CEOs and these C-suite individuals never really got engaged. I think years later, fast forward to where we are now, the idea that a CEO can hide behind or make a statement that they're not aware of a cyber risk, given all that has happened over the last few years, just picking the major hacks, I don't think they have that luxury anymore. And I think the consequences for a CEO who doesn't take the necessary action is problematic for that CEO, for those leaders of the organization. In fact, we've seen that regulators come in and ask the board questions. Have you discussed your cyber risk exposure? What are the actions taken? And so forth and so on. I would submit that the CEOs need to be proactive in this and really look at it. Ultimately, Eddie, if they don't decide that the organizational chart should be as you suggest, they should at least put some mandate in place that require at least a report, a notification, or something. The CEO needs to ultimately show engagement. And I love your recommendation. I think it's the right recommendation. But even allowing for some organizations that may not see the value in it, they should still implement some kind of program in there that allows the CEO to be notified and made aware of whatever the risks are.
Right. So maybe the CEOs who are trying to hide, maybe that's why they want to keep the CISO at the CIO level there. But you know what? I think it would be a more than a gesture of good faith, but a declaration that I'm taking this seriously as a CEO. Because look, the CEO's training is what? They're most likely a business degree, an accounting degree, and then an MBA, right? No technical background in that at all. They aren't techies, right? Same with general counsel, right? General counsel, law, business, right? Sometimes MBA type training. So to bring the CISO in would also force the CISO into a business dialogue, which is needed. To be fair to the folks in our industry whom I adore and everybody on this call, we need to become a little bit more business-minded too. But it would also force the CEO and the general counsel to truly understand either that's a Pandora's box of technology I don't understand, and I need to trust this guy and engage in a risk dialogue. But it will also say, or the CEO, I need to understand this person's role in this person's life. So look, ladies and gentlemen, right at the top of the hour, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Without you, the participants, we wouldn't have direction. It's for you that give us direction. And next week, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about, where that CISO should report. That would be very interesting. Look out for some posts from James. He'll be highlighting that as well. And we got a last comment here, security at the speed of business. Absolutely. I've loved that saying that. It's a beautiful one to end on. Next week, James will be back with myself. 8 o'clock Eastern time. Let's keep it up and raise a little bit of money for wounded warriors and see if we can't embarrass James as much as possible. We've got a few more comments. I know you're pounding them in, so let's have them happen. Sam, thanks for jumping in here. Looking at the scope of risk, seems like email is a common thread here. Yeah, you're right. Should we rethink this medium for communication? Please, can we rethink email? It's so 2012. My goodness. And Matt, I appreciate you so much. So thank you very much for that. Miguel, it's always fun. I love doing this show. Danielle, you're so welcome. It's me that thanks you. Absolutely. And Jeff, thank you for being here. Absolutely wonderful. And nice to meet everybody. Please connect up over LinkedIn. We can continue this conversation as well over LinkedIn. It's been a blast. Ari, would you like to close us out by saying goodbye?
Absolutely, Eddie. Once again, I want to thank you and James, and most importantly, those who joined us online tonight at the TechTownSquare. It's been a fabulous conversation. I don't know where the 60 minutes went, but it was great. And really the success from my view of today's episode is our audience. They truly are engaged, which means you and James are onto something here. Really appreciate the opportunity. So thank you all and have a great night. And I look forward to seeing you at the Town Square again.
Thank you for being here, Ari. Absolutely marvelous. Appreciate it.